Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second virtual Commercial Compliance Summit. We're incredibly happy to see you here, and we have some great sessions lined up for today. So throughout each session, please feel free to submit any questions you have through the GoToWebinar questions module, and we will answer them at the end of the session. So our agenda today includes Mark Farrar, who's the Managing Director, Group Compliance Leader at Epsilon Life Sciences, and he'll be presenting a session on healthcare compliance principles. After Mark, we have Chris Gingras, who's our Chief Product Officer or Product Strategy Officer here at Medispend, and he'll be discussing the importance of identifying and managing risk. And closing up the summit today will be Jay Ward, Director of Life Science Solutions here at Medispend, who will be presenting a session on auditing and monitoring interactions with HCPs using data analytics. The PowerPoints for each of these presentations is available for download in the handout section of GoToWebinar. We'll also be recording this summit and we'll make it available for download. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Mark Farrar, who will kick off our summit. Mark is Managing Director and Group Compliance Leader at Epsilon Life Sciences and is based in Atlanta, Georgia. He advises clients in the US, Europe, South America, Africa, and Asia on complex issues such as the SEC's financial accounting investigations, white-collar crime allegations, FCPA matters, False Claim Act damages, violations of the anti-kickback statute, pharmaceutical sales and marketing compliance, economic damages, global transparency, privacy and GDPR issues, risk assessments, auditing and monitoring assessments, and helping companies build and develop governance structures that are right-sized for the organization. Mark has also served as the Global Chief Compliance Officer for a multi-billion-dollar medical device and diagnostics company with over 50 worldwide locations, and for a mid-sized global pharmaceutical company, and served as the U.S. Integrity and Compliance Officer and oversaw global sanctions. So, Mark, that was a handful. Let me hand
It
it over to
was.
you, and you can start off the presentation.
And thanks for the introduction. That's a lot there, but those are all the risks that compliance faces, essentially. So today I wanted to cover what I'll call broadly just healthcare compliance principles. So where we'll start is what are the enforcement trends right now? Because those should tell you a picture of what the government is focused on. And if you're doing something that you see someone being prosecuted for, well, it's time to rethink that because that's something that's on their agenda. But how do you govern and guide these? Really, you can develop your compliance programs around what the government guidance is for sure, but what they're putting in and reviewing in corporate integrity agreements. But you also have a number of different government entities looking at this. So there is OIG, but then there's also the Department of Justice, and each of them have their own separate guidances while they can sort of be mapped to each other. You also have the FDA and a number of other industry associations. So it's a changing landscape for how you develop and evolve your compliance program. But lastly, I've got some slides here on the government's expectation, excuse me, for boards. And I probably won't get to those actually, but if you download the slides, there are a number of questions that you should be asking yourself around the 7 elements, which is something we'll talk here about in a second. So as we talk about um, government enforcement, the way I kind of look at this is that there's been 3 big waves of government enforcement actions that sort of can be grouped together. In the very beginning with corporate integrity agreements, the first wave was focused on government pricing. And while those was the first foray into what a CIA requirements were, the second wave, which was around off-label sales and marketing, was absolutely the biggest wave. It was the tsunami, if you want to call it anything, because there were a number of billion-dollar settlements within these off-label sales and marketing investigations and settlements. And then recently, then there has been a look under the hood, if you will, with patient assistance programs, and a number of companies have come under scrutiny for these patient assistance programs, and it's actually a different way that the anti-kickback statute had been utilized. Most people think of the anti-kickback statute being targeted at like an HCP, bribing them for prescriptions, but it's an inducement law essentially, and frankly, this patient assistance programs were around the inducement to the patient because they were willing to pay for their copays, where the other 80% was covered by the government and such. So these three waves have occurred, and where we are right now, I'm actually seeing a lot of enforcement actions that are more akin to the off-label sales and marketing CIAs, but there are a lot of things right now that are brewing around speaker programs. So will that be the next wave of these enforcement actions? The drug pricing world as well, which was sort of covered in wave one, it's changed. And frankly, not a lot of people understand how drug pricing actually works and what rebates are needed and such. And then lastly, I think social media has come to the forefront. We've seen actually some settlements with what I'll call social media influencers that aren't HCPs. It's the Kim Kardashians of the world, and they're being paid by companies to endorse these products, but they're not giving fair balance to them, or they're talking about things that overreach what the label says. So even though they're not a physician, they still have to stay within the bounds of what the label says. So we'll see how this really plays out. But as I said, corporate integrity agreements are a place that people can look to. What are they including as the requirements for these corporate integrity agreements? And really, companies that get into a corporate integrity agreement, they have a settlement, they pay a fine, and it varies. But the CIA is what I refer to as the penalty box. It's usually 5 years that you have to abide by a number of additional rules. You have to hire a monitor through an IRO or independent review organization. Some of them have a board expert requirement and such. But during those 5 years, you have certain requirements, and then you exit the CIA. Now, what if you don't agree to a CIA? Well, then you can get barred from federal programs. So it's sort of their way to say, all right, you've been naughty, go stand in the corner for 5 years, and then we'll let you roam free again, if you will. But now there's a number of companies that are under a corporate integrity agreement that go right into the next one, and then into the next one, like a continuous one that they have. So, but these agreements will tell you a little bit about what the government is thinking and what they expect, frankly, of your program. So I use this as an example, is that in 2009, in Pfizer's corporate integrity agreement, that was the first time we ever saw what they referred to as RAMP, which is the risk assessment process. And now it's been included in CIAs after, and frankly, now it's a benchmark. All companies should be doing that. And if you're not, you should ask yourself, why am I not doing a risk assessment? Because that's what the government expects of you now. It's become the benchmark. So you can look to these agreements essentially to see the government's thought process and what they think an effective compliance program looks like. Early on, the federal sentencing guidelines, they outlined to prosecutors essentially, how am I going to evaluate a company's conduct if we're going to enter into a settlement with them? Is it egregious, or is it, hey, risk happens and you can't avoid all risk, but they had something in place and it just fell through the cracks? You're still going to get in trouble, but you might not get in as much trouble because you've put forth a good faith effort and looking actually into the risk itself. But this was the first set of guidelines that basically told companies what they expect of compliance programs, and how do they look to compliance programs, and frankly, when they're prosecuting, if they are, is it a good program? Is it not a good program? Was it effective? Because if you did have an effective compliance program, in all chances, you're likely going to get some sort of credit for it. So But this was the first early indications from the government of guidance on what they expected. And then in 2003, the seven elements were released from the OIG. And, and frankly, this has been the hallmark of what compliance programs shape themselves around. And while this was directed towards pharmaceutical manufacturers, it's really can be industry agnostic in some sense. But and they're high level principles. But again, as you look at your compliance program, you need to have a compliance officer, and you need to have written policies and procedures. You need to train people on those standards and communicate with them about those particular standards and any changes. And part of that training, you actually need to really look how effective it is. There probably needs to be some sort of learning module that you're testing someone on the criteria on what you're training them to see how well they're retaining it. And these are really proactive steps. And then you sort of move into a little bit of a reactive piece where you're looking at auditing and monitoring. And frankly, this is where the rubber meets the road. So you're going to test to see, are we following our written standards? So you need to have those first before you can audit and monitor against them. And then lastly, around when something does go awry, how quick were you to investigate it and put in corrective actions? And frankly, do you have disciplinary guidelines around what if someone does make a mistake? What are the ramifications? And they need to be consistent as well. So again, this can be very industry agnostic, but developing your program around these seven elements really can help you. And it's not just at a point in time, it's an evolving process. So really most companies look to these sort of fundamental seven elements as they're creating their compliance programs. So recently in November 2023, the OIG reinstituted their revised guidance. And while they reinforced the seven elements piece, they also said, listen, there are certain risks that are germane to specific segments of the healthcare industry, like pharma. Med device has a certain type of risk, but hospitals have different types of risks. So they're going to be releasing industry specific guidance starting now through 2026. So they reinforced this whole what they said before in 2003, but they added also onto it. They specifically outlined what the board's role should be in the compliance program and where compliance officers sit in the organization, which is always an ongoing argument because if you're not under a corporate integrity agreement, a lot of times compliance might sit under legal. Probably shouldn't ever sit under finance. It's probably okay in legal, but ultimately the government would view that as, hey, you need to actually have a direct reporting line to the CEO or the board or something along those lines. So generally speaking, as a requirement in corporate integrity agreements, it's a requirement that you are not under legal. What they also reinforced here was what should be the incentives and consequences for when enforcing compliance, because we always think of the stick, but really, is there a carrot out there as well that you can incentivize someone for being compliant? And I know a lot of companies are thinking about how do you go about doing that right now. One thing that this revised guidance reinforced is they specifically said now this one step where they said audit and monitoring. Now they say audit, monitoring, and risk assessment. So they've reinforced you need to be conducting a risk assessment even on an annual basis, because frankly, once you know what your risk, you can develop your auditing and monitoring plans. So you're going and reviewing those risks that are most germane to your organization. So more to come on the general compliance program guidance from the OIG. But that said, now the DOJ, I think it was in 2017, they released guidance that was industry agnostic, but basically said how should prosecutors evaluate healthcare compliance programs, and they put it around three different questions you should ask yourself, but then had a number of sub bullets. And those sub bullets, I'll say, are elements, and there's 12 of them. So they might have 12 elements. The what we were referring to earlier as the seven elements. They all sort of map to each other in various ways, but this is industry agnostic, and where it expands on some of the seven elements. It specifically calls out things around third party management or due diligence during mergers and acquisitions. Do you have an appropriate amount of resources as well? So these questions that they have their prosecutors ask: is the compliance program designed well? And a well-designed program has those things in the seven elements that we talked about: policies, procedures, training, communication, that sort of thing. But is the program implemented in good faith? Meaning, this isn't a paper program. This isn't just the check the box sort of exercise. This is something that you've implemented in good faith to detect and correct any risks or things that you see. But does it also work in practice? So what this also means is that compliance programs are only as good as they are at a point in time. You may get 100% on the test today, but the test tomorrow is going to have different questions. So you need to prepare yourself and evolve your compliance program with the changing risk landscape, essentially. So another area to look for as you're developing your compliance program is around case law. So the first most notable case law, I think, in this area is around the Caremark doctrine, which is in the 90s. And frankly, what this said was is that boards have a fiduciary duty to the corporation itself to act in good faith. And what does that mean? That means you have to ask questions. You can't just be a board member, sit back and collect whatever you're getting paid to be in that role. You actually have a duty to the organization itself to ask questions, and you need to know what risks the organization face. What are they doing about those sorts of risks? So this puts liability essentially on the board of directors itself to ask those questions about compliance. So in another area around just what I'll say is guidance, for instance, Sally Yates in 2015, when she was with the Department of Justice, she basically came out, and it's referred to as the Yates memo, that essentially she said, we need individuals to be held responsible. And frankly, you can't hide behind the company itself, because the company has deep pockets and they can pay lots of settlements. But when you go after someone individually, and that individual is thinking, I might be behind bars, guess what? They might shape up a lot faster, and they might ask those risk questions and decide, that's maybe a risk we shouldn't take. So this was instructing the Department of Justice that you need to have, when you're prosecuting these, you need to look to individuals being accountable for this as well. Fast forward to 2021, the Monaco memo, as it's referred to, expanded on the Yates memo, and basically said that the CEO and CCO, you need to sign off on resolutions. We need, when we're doing these investigations, we need to know all the people that were involved, not just the people that you've brought forth. If you've done an internal investigation, said here's our finding, we need to know everyone, what their individual accountability will be. And frankly, as we evaluate your program, we'll look to see how cooperative you are with us, and frankly, if you do have a well-designed program, you will get credit for that. But if you don't cooperate with us, and this is a sweep under the rug kind of thing, we're going to throw the hammer at you. So again, this guidance that the government has come out and given, it just really is a telling tale of what compliance officers, as you're designing your program, and frankly, as you're soliciting within your organization support for compliance. It's not, hey, I'm saying this, it's the government is saying this. So these are guidances themselves, so they're not a law, but this is how the enforcement side of the law is going to actually start to look at these things and go after as they're through their enforcement efforts. Other guidance that's out there, there are a number of jointly authored papers and such, that outlines what the board's responsibility is and for corporate compliance. And one of these was through the AHLA, and they partnered with the OIG, and they wrote what these responsibilities are. I have a link to this in this presentation. If you don't have this, this is actually something that you should take a look at. While they're high level principles and such, and it's not sort of a rules based thing, it does outline, and frankly, boards should, if they haven't read this, they should be trained on something like this, and this is a good resource for it. When you look at compliance programs, you should also look at where you are in your life cycle. So pre-commercial companies have different sets of risks than very well established companies. So I'm putting up this maturity scale, and this is an example from my own company, that when we look at effectiveness of compliance programs, really how it's designed. So at the reactive stage, there's nothing in place. You're just responding to things that happen. You're a firefighter in all sense. But as you develop tools and repeatable processes, you're moving down that maturity scale. And frankly, I tell organizations the target for all of your pieces and parts of your compliance program is at the defined and managed stage. You don't need to be at the top end of this scale. Well, parts of your program might be. It doesn't need to be for all pieces and parts, because again, compliance evolves. So you should always, at minimum, be at a defined and managed state, but striving to be at more of a sustained or optimized levels. But again, that's going to change over time. So again, I'll wrap up here in a second. I've given some practical guidance that you should share with your boards as well, and around these principles of how the boards should operate, and questions that they essentially should be asking themselves of the organization, so they're informed. And this is important too, because as part of my job, I serve as an expert witness occasionally, opining on the effectiveness of compliance programs. And I will tell you that a strong fact is that if there are board meeting minutes, and at each board meeting there is a section that they talk about risk management, and a compliance officer is presenting, or an outside, whatever it may be, that in itself is a documented way that the board is looking at risk. So I would strongly encourage you as compliance officers to try to get a piece on the agenda of every board meeting to talk about risk. And maybe that is an inform the board of where you stand on maybe major investigations or something along those lines. But also there needs to be an educational component to it as well, that you're sharing, for instance, the revised guidance the OIG came out with. That might be a topic that you can cover with them and give them as a pre-read, but summarizing where the government's lens is on these types of programs, and how are we handling risk as an organization? Because if a government entity comes knocking on the door, they're going to be knocking on the door of our company, but they're going to come and talk to each and every one of you as the board of directors of this organization. And frankly, you might be held liable through, for instance, the Caremark doctrine. Did you oblige with your fiduciary duty? So there's been a lot more emphasis from the government of holding boards accountable and making sure that they're asking the right questions. So with that, I think I'll stop because, but if there's any questions, please put them in the chat box. My contact information is here as well. So please, if you wanted to have a separate conversation about any of these, but all the items that I discussed today also are within the presentation at the end with a link to where they can be found on the internet. So with that, thank you everybody, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Mark. We haven't had any questions, but like Mark mentioned, the presentation is absolutely available in our material section within GoToWebinar. So we definitely encourage you to download it and see the rest of the slides that Mark had put together. So moving on now, we do have Chris Gingras, and Chris is Medispend's Chief Product Strategy Officer. With 20 plus years of experience working with life sciences, medical device, and provider organizations of all sizes, he's an experienced compliance and business ethics leader. He's passionate about providing expert advice to clients on resolving complex regulatory issues and assisting in the development of global compliance programs that effectively minimize business risk. Before joining us over here at Medispend, Chris founded MedComply, where he developed an innovative software solution to simplify many tasks associated with managing the day-to-day activities of a compliance program. So we have Chris here with us, and Chris, you'll just have to share your presentation. You should have presenter.
Can you see my screen?
Awesome. Yes.
Awesome. Thanks for the kind introduction. Thank you, Mark, for setting the stage. If there's any questions as I go through, please put those in the chat and we'll try to answer them at the end. So continuing on and building on what Mark had shared, we're going to talk about in more detail building out your risk assessment. So we're going to talk about building out your organizational risk assessment, building a compliance work plan, at a high level talking about conducting third-party due diligence. So as Mark had mentioned, and I think this is pretty, clear cut, right? If the government shows up at your door, and hopefully they don't, that's going to be a bad day. But they're going to ask you, and they're going to ask three questions. Is the organization's compliance program well designed? Is it being applied earnestly in good faith? And then does it actually work? And those are the three basic questions that they're going to be asking. And as a compliance professional and as an executive at a company, as a board member, you're going to want to make sure that you can answer these questions, immediately and document and show that you can, meet each of these three items. And the starting point for their evaluation of whether a company has a well-designed program is how has the company identified, assessed, and defined its risk profile? So, Mark touched on this. Like, if you don't know what your risks are, how can you build your compliance work plan? How do you know what to work on? How do you know what to focus on? How do you know what controls to implement within your organization? So this is really the fundamental starting point. How has your organization identified, assessed, and defined its risk profile? And again, you want to be able to show the Department of Justice, the investigator, the FBI officer, the documentation to answer this question. So these are some of the key criteria that they're going to be using to evaluate the risk assessment. What methodology have you used? And there's some methodologies, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. Is the organization allocating resources based on the risks? Is the risk assessment being updated and revised based on, new investigations, changes in the business model, changes in the regulatory landscape? So is this a living, breathing risk assessment? As you're doing your risk assessment or you're doing your monitoring and auditing activities, you might be learning things. and are you applying those lessons, right? So again, this is all meant to be a living, breathing document. And then how are you managing emerging risks? So I thought this was kind of interesting in that the recent guidance that they released in September, they specifically talked about AI. So they have a whole new section on AI, and they're saying, your risk assessment needs to be looking at emerging areas such as AI. And in my opinion, this should have always been part of your risk assessment. 20 years ago, it might not have been AI, 15 years ago, but in general, your risk assessment needs to be looking at new business models, new technologies, new markets. There's always, every year, this year it's AI. Who knows what it's going to be in 5 years? Maybe it's autonomous robots. I mean, who knows what it's going to be? But your risk assessment needs to always be considering and include new things that are happening. And again, that could be new markets, new business models, new service lines, new programs that you're offering. But I thought it was really fascinating that they specifically called out AI in their latest guidance. So, if you have not already, this is an area that you need to be looking at. How is your organization using AI? And everyone sort of has a different definition of AI. In many cases, it's not actually AI in terms of the definition. But in any event, your risk assessment should be including a part for AI now, especially if the government is specifically calling that out. I'm going to go through one model real quickly. This is the COSO model. If you're not familiar with it, a quick Google, you can read about it. It's not the most exciting thing to read. It's much more on, internal audit, financial controls. But this is a model, and it's a well-recognized model. But there's the COSO cube, essentially. And at the top here, we have operations, reporting, and compliance. These are sort of the goals of the company, which we'll talk about real quickly. And then on this side of the cube, we have the internal controls, which I'll also talk about briefly. And then, so I have my goals, I have the internal controls that I'm going to be implementing. And then these internal controls need to be implemented at different levels of the organization. So, at the entity level, the division level, the operating unit, and at the functional level. So this is kind of one model. There's other models out there, but in my mind, this is a great one to use as you're building out your risk assessment within the organization. So when I look at the goals of the company, the operations objectives, refer to the entity's business processes, goals, protections of assets. So that's kind of the operations objective. The reporting objective, relates to the reliability of external and financial and non-financial reporting. So these are really accurate financial statements. When we think about the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act, books and records, those sorts of things. So there's a operations objective, there's a reporting objective, and then there's a compliance objective, which most of the individuals on this call today are responsible for, the laws and regulations that your organization is subject to. So these are sort of the business goals, and they're being put into 3 buckets under the COSO model. And then there's 5 different internal controls. And you're going to see that these correlate to the 7 elements of an effective compliance program. These correlate to the DOJ guidance, but there's the control environment. That's the tone of the organization. That's the organizational commitment to ethical and compliant behavior. There's the risk assessment, which we're going to talk about in more detail. Then there's your policies and procedures, your actual control objectives. Then there's the communication, reporting, and then and I'll touch on this at the end, that the communication also needs to include third parties. So this ties into third party due diligence, and then monitoring. So hopefully you can sort of see if you can easily map the COSO internal controls to the 7 elements of an effective compliance program. But the risk assessment is identifying the risks that could impact the achievement of the 3 objectives that we had talked about previously. So, so when we're doing the risk assessment, this particular model is looking at those 3 objectives. And there's different models out there, but this is just one model that you could consider in building out your risk assessment. But as you could see in the guidance, one of the questions is what model did you use, right? So it would be great to say, well, I'm using the COSO model to build out my, internal control framework, my risk assessment, and then have a little bit of structure to it, versus just not having a model at all that you're using. So our risk assessments required, yes, right? We can kind of see that in the guidance. It's the first thing that the government is going to be looking for. If you look at HIPAA, if you look at corporate integrity agreements, if you look at COSO, the list can just go on and on of the governmental guidance, the best practices that all relate to. You can look at like Sarbanes-Oxley that requires risk assessments if you're a publicly traded company. So a compliance risk assessment is absolutely required. So if you're not already doing a risk assessment, or maybe you are doing a risk assessment and there's an opportunity to enhance or update it. But in general, these are kind of high level the steps, right, that you need to go through. But the first thing is really to build out your risk register. So when you're looking at building a risk assessment, there's an enterprise risk assessment, and then there's also a compliance risk assessment. Now, depending on the size of the company, if you're a smaller company, you might not be doing enterprise risk assessments. If you're a large company, you probably have an entire risk department. You have, an internal auditor that's doing the, enterprise risk assessment. Or you can just be doing a compliance risk assessment. But the enterprise risk assessment would be looking big picture. What are the organizational risks? So that could be, hurricanes like Milton. It could be like COVID. It could be financial risk. It could be human resource risk. Versus compliance risk would be focused on compliance things like off-label promotion, anti-kickback, anti-bribery, those kinds of things. So either A, you can take your compliance risk assessment and work collaboratively and integrate that into the ERM, or you could just do a separate compliance risk assessment. I mean, that'll sort of be an organizational decision. And ultimately what you're doing is once you sort of build out this risk register, you're going to go to the organization and you're going to ask the leadership team, the board, the executive leadership and management to rate these risks. And we'll talk about it in a minute, but we're going to ask them to rate the risk based on the likelihood of it happening and what is the impact if that risk happens. So the impact could be high, but the likelihood could be really low. So overall, that would be a low to medium risk. If the impact is high and the likelihood is high, then that's going to be a high risk. But in general, you're going to ask the board, the executive leadership, and management to rate these risks, whether those are just compliance risks or enterprise risks, based on the likelihood and the impact of that risk. And you want to separate it. So you want to know, like, these are the board people, these are the executive leadership people, and these are the management people. Because you want to try to compare it, right? Like the board might have a different view of risks to the organization than the executive leadership, than the management. And you can even include employees as well if you had wanted to do this. But you're trying to get the organization to rate these risks. And then based on the results of these surveys that you've done, you're going to want to identify the top 5 or 10 risks based on the results. So you're going to pick the 10 highest, and maybe there's going to be some that are like rated the same, and you could meet with your compliance committee to discuss this. And all of this, I'll just highlight as well, that when you're setting up and building the risk assessment, you're going to want to do this collaboratively with the compliance committee, maybe with a few members of leadership. This is not something that you want to do in a vacuum. You want to be working with other people within the organization to build this risk assessment, because that's going to help you get buy-in. But ultimately, you're going to end up with 5 to 10 risks, because you're going to be starting with 100 risks, and you're going to get to the top 5 or 10, because you want to be focusing on the top risks. You want to be allocating resources to the top risks. And then you're going to come up with these risks, and then you're going to identify a risk owner. And typically, this is going to be somebody in the business. So as a compliance person, you don't want to be owning these risks. The business owns the risk. I want the business person to go to jail. I don't want to go to jail. So you're going to want to identify a business person to own this risk. Now you're going to be managing it, overseeing it, holding them accountable, but there should be a business person that is owning each of these risks. And maybe there's a compliance risk that you're owning, but in a perfect world, you're identifying a business person that owns this risk. And then you're going to identify controls that relate to that risk. So, I have I have a risk of like anti-corruption, anti-bribery, and then the controls are going to be like policies and procedures, training, distributor questionnaires, um, contracts, whatever those controls are, you're going to want to document. That might be screening. So you're going to be identifying whatever these controls are. And then it's going to be really important to have board and senior leadership oversight. So the board should be signing off on this, the senior leadership team, the compliance committee should all be signing off on this. And then you should be reporting on a regular basis to the board. And again, Mark had talked about this, right? Like board minutes are really critical, right? Like you want to be able to go to the board and say, here's our risk assessment. They sign off on it. And then 2 months later, when you go back to the board or the audit and compliance committee of the board, they're reviewing it and saying, okay, well, how are we doing on managing these risks? What did Bob, the business owner, do? Are we making progress? Have we implemented any new controls? So they want to see that the organization is effectively managing and mitigating these risks. So board and senior leadership oversight is critical. And then ideally, you're also considering the potential for fraud when you're doing your risk assessment. That gets a little bit into more of the ERM, fraud risk assessment. This might be something that's done more by like your internal audit team, but just something to think about. A fully featured risk assessment would include fraud and the potential for fraud in that risk assessment. And ideally, you're reevaluating and updating this annually. You might not need to do the risk assessment every year, but I would say at least every 2 years, you want to redo the risk assessment every 2 to 3 years. But in any event, even if you're not redoing it, you want to be reviewing and updating it annually. Like, does this still make sense? Maybe the world changed and now there's a new risk, right? Like AI as an example. Like maybe you need to add AI as a risk to your risk, the risk that you're monitoring. So you definitely want to be updating this. It doesn't want to be, oh, we did this once and then like we're not going to look at it again. And just to touch on the risk rating in more detail, and this is standard. In this case here, you can see that there's a 5-tier model. There's like the likelihood is rare, unlikely, possible, likely, or almost certain. Some companies have a 6-tier model, maybe a 4-tier, but in general, there's usually 5. So what is the impact of this happening? Like a hurricane is a great example. I'm in Florida right now. The impact of Milton is pretty significant. I'm in northern Florida, so the likelihood of that is lower, right? So that would be, possible, and the impact would be major. So then it would sort of put me in this quadrant, essentially. So you have the impact and likelihood, and that's going to help you determine your risk rating. And this is less typical, but I do see some companies use the concept of velocity, like how quickly would this happen? The hurricane is another example, but you kind of know like a week in advance, right, that this is coming, versus a tornado, which might just pop up. So the speed at which things happen, the speed at which risks happen, could impact that risk rating. So just something to think about, but it is like a newer concept, like the speed at which things are happening. This is less typical. The impact and likelihood are like, anybody that's doing a risk assessment is using impact and likelihood. And ultimately you end up with a risk rating. And then what you're going to try to do is you're going to evaluate the control effectiveness. So on the previous slide, I was talking about that you're going to assign controls to risks. Based on the controls, if you have exceptional controls or very good controls, that's going to mitigate the risk. So I might go from high risk to a lower risk based on my control effectiveness. So that's going to drive down the risk rating. So I'm going to end up with this concept of a residual risk rating. Now, if I have very, very poor controls, maybe the risk rating doesn't change at all. And the goal would be to implement better controls to drive down that residual risk rating. And these are the things that the board is going to be monitoring. Like, what are the things that you're doing to better manage this risk to drive it down? Then another concept as well is like, I've identified my 10 risks. A lot of companies will identify a key risk. So this is like really, really critical to the company. That might be like business risk, human resource risk. Maybe there's a really big compliance risk. But you would identify like one or two key risks. So this is like absolutely fundamental to the business. We really have to carefully manage this. Like, let's say you have a manufacturing medical device company, and there's only one supplier of your product in Bulgaria. That's a key risk, right? Like, you're one supplier, right? So you might want to monitor like your supplier, because if that company goes out of business, like, your business is done, right? Because they're the only supplier of your product. So that's a key risk. And this would be something that's at the top of the list. The board's monitoring, not just the audit and compliance committee of the board, as an example. This might be discussed at senior leadership meetings, on a dashboard or something like that. When we also think about risk as well is, and I think as a compliance person, right, like, you're always trying to like, let's eliminate all risk. That's just not how it works, right? Like, a company wouldn't be in business if they didn't accept risk. So when you're looking at managing risk, there's a couple different ways that you can treat that risk, right? Like, you can avoid it, you can just like not do it, and paying bribes to doctors would be a good one that that's probably good to avoid. You can pursue that risk, right? Like, there's risk with going to market to China, but there's a huge opportunity. So we're going to pursue that risk. Now, we're going to implement controls to manage that risk, but we're going to pursue that risk. I could reduce that risk. I could implement controls. Maybe I can outsource some of that risk. So there's different things that I could do to reduce that risk. I could share the risk. That might be getting insurance, as an example. So if I buy insurance, I'm sharing that risk with an insurance company. And that could be, directors and officers insurance, as an example. Or I can just accept the risk and say, hey, this is just part of doing business. But I do think this is important, that sometimes as a compliance professional, we're always focused on like eliminating risk. And that's in some ways not our job, right? Our job is to go to the business and say, these are the risks, these are the high risk, and then the business makes a decision. And in some cases, you're going to say, like, that is not a risk that we want to accept, right? Like, we're never going to pay kickbacks to doctors. But there's other things that, like, hey, there is some risk, but we're going to accept that risk. We're going to manage that risk. We're going to monitor that risk, but we have to accept it, or we're not going to be in business in the future. So these are just some buckets of risk treatment. And then from a risk control perspective, these are just controls, right? There's preventive controls, there's detective controls. So you can prevent it. Detective would be monitoring. Corrective would be correcting things that you've identified. Policies and procedures, training and communication, monitoring and reviews. Again, these are all the 7 elements. Like, all the things that you're doing to have an effective compliance program are helping you manage and mitigate and control that risk. And this is just an example of the risk universe. And we have strategic initiative risk, product demand risk, pricing risk, regulatory risk. The compliance risk would be like off-label promotion. You can get as granular as you want. In general, you don't want to get too granular. What is the risk of like providing kickbacks or promoting it off-label, or bribery, or improper hourly payments to consultants, or whatever it might be, right? You would sort of build out your risk. You don't want to go to the business with like 300 risks, right? And have them like rate everything. You want to have like 50 to 60 risks, maybe, that they're kind of rating. If you're just doing compliance, maybe that's smaller. Maybe it's like 30 or 40 risks that they're rating. But if you're doing an enterprise risk assessment, you're building that in a form. It's online. They're going through and answering the questions. It takes them like 15 or 20 minutes if they're thoughtful and they're just answering the questions. But this is just an example of risks. And then this is an example of a risk comparison where we have like the risks from the executive VP and board and the director and manager. In general, the risks that the leadership team at the executive VP level should match the director and manager list, with 1 or 2 discrepancies. If there's complete discrepancies, then that's a much bigger problem in the organization, right? Like, the business, the director and manager level does not understand what's critical to the organization or the risk, right? So that would be a very telling exercise, right? If the board thinks these are what the risks are, and the CEO thinks the risks are different, like, that's a much bigger problem. And it's good to know that, right? Like, you guys got to start talking to each other if there's a complete misalignment. But you should see something kind of like this, right? Like, the order might be a little different. There might be one or two that are different, because at the director or manager level, as an example, I'm actually selling the product, right? So I'm more concerned about pricing risk. Whereas at the board level, I'm more focused on like big picture financials, profitability. So there's going to be some differences, but there shouldn't be like significant differences. So that's kind of big picture, the risk assessment. Once you've built out your risk assessment, that's really going to be driving your compliance work plan. So based on what the risks are, your compliance work plan is going to be looking at, like writing policies and procedures, building out these controls. Your monitoring activities in your compliance work plan should relate to the risks, right? Like, here's our top risk. These are the monitoring activities I'm going to do. Here's my second top risk. These are the monitoring activities I'm going to do. So each of those risks that you have should have specific line items. So you're going to have like an Excel file or a platform that has your things that you're going to do, your to-do list, and then another column is going to be your risks. So everything that you're working on should be tied to a risk. Now, there's going to be things you're doing that are not tied to a risk, but in general, things that you're doing should be tied to a risk in the system. And you want to be focused on the top things, right? Like if you have like 10 risks and there's nothing in your work plan for the first 9, but then the 10th one you have something, that's not great, right? The government's going to come in and say, well, how come you don't have anything tied to these 10? So you want to be able to like definitively tie and report the risks to your work plan. So all your monitoring activities, the policies and procedures, the training that you're doing should be focused on those top 5 or top 10 risks that have been identified. And then the risk assessment is not going to be the only thing, right? There's lots of other things that you're working on as well. So you can't just like focus on the risk assessment. There's going to be other things that are going to be on your work plan that might not necessarily tie to a risk. But if in some way you could tie that to a risk, that would be better. And the last comment I'll make on this as well is that whenever you've built your work plan, this should be signed off on and monitored by the board, your audit and compliance committee, the internal compliance committee. So again, going back to what Mark said about like the meeting minutes, like I would go to the board and say, hey guys, you should ask me about my compliance work plan and how I'm doing. And so they're not going to do this, right? You have to prompt them to do this, at least in my experience. So I'm going to have slides on that. And I'm going to prompt them with questions. Like I would actually like meet for breakfast with the chair of the audit committee and be like, hey, at the next meeting, ask me these 3 questions. And at the meeting, he would ask me these 3 questions and it would be documented in the meeting minutes. And it's just getting the board involved, the audit and compliance committee involved, and understanding that they need to be asking you about your compliance work plan. They need to be asking you about the risk assessment. They need to be tracking your progress. They need to be holding you accountable to that work plan. Like, I guess that's another thing too, right? Like, you know, if you have your work plan, you need to be actually doing the things in your work plan as well, like accomplishing them, getting them done. And if you're not, then that's a problem, right? Like if you have 100 things in your work plan, but you can't get the resources to do them or nobody's supporting you, then that's a problem, right? And then the board should be supporting you and the audit and compliance committee should be supporting you. But I think this item is really important that you need to get the board and compliance committee to sign off on your work plan. Now the sort of final part of the presentation is third-party due diligence. And you know, this is also in the guidance, but a well-designed compliance program applies risk-based due diligence to its third-party relationships. You saw in a previous slide that the government was looking at how you're communicating. The COSA model is looking at how you're communicating to your third parties, but your third parties are an integral part of your compliance program. They're an integral part of your risk assessment. You know, you look at anti-corruption, anti-bribery. I do joke about going to jail. You definitely don't want to go to jail in like China or a foreign country. So this needs to be a part of your compliance work plan, your risk assessment. Just something to keep in mind, you know, whether you're doing business globally. If you're doing business globally, it's much higher risk. If you're just, you know, operating in the US, it's lower risk, but there still is risk. Now, from a third-party perspective, you know, you want to be looking at like, you know, who are your third parties? What kind of work are they doing? What kind of controls do you have over those third parties? You know, contractual relationships, screening, monitoring, who's managing these relationships? Are they being held accountable for any inappropriate behaviors? So especially if you're on the med device side and you're engaging third parties to market and sell your product, that's probably the bigger risk. Suppliers, manufacturers, regulatory agencies, how close are these third parties to the government? Is the brother of the third party owner, the president of a country or something like that? So as you're building out your compliance work plan, as you're building out your risk assessment, do not lose sight of your third parties, and at a minimum build out like the basics of a third party due diligence program. And then just real quickly, within the platform, and there's other tools out there that do this, but there's a couple things that you're going to want to do with your third parties, right? There's going to be screening, global screening, US screening. You should be doing some kind of risk rating of your third party. So what's the dollar value of the contract? What type of work are they doing for you? Do they have relationships with government officials? So you need to go through some kind of risk rating, right? If they're the lawn care person, low risk, I don't need to waste my time. Oh wait, they're like, the distributor in, Botswana, then that's higher risk, right? So you want to identify your higher risk vendors or third parties by doing some kind of risk rating. And then you're doing the screening. You're normally going to be assigning some kind of questionnaire to them. So an anti-corruption, anti-bribery questionnaire, an onboarding questionnaire, privacy, anti-slavery, conflict minerals, whatever those kinds of things are, you're going to want to assign some kind of questionnaire to them that they're completing. And then you're going to want to get some kind of documentation that they've reviewed and validated your policies. They've completed some kinds of training courses. You want to not just look at the principals or owners of the company, but maybe you look at the senior executives, key officers, those sorts of things. But you can sort of keep building out and strengthening your third party program. But I do think this is a pretty big risk for a lot of organizations that they might not have a good handle on. And this does tie into an effective compliance program. It does tie into your risk assessment. So that was all that I have. I don't know if there's any questions, but I'll stop before I turn it over to Jay.
Hey, Chris, thank you so much. We don't have any questions in yet, so we can turn this over to Jay Ward. Jay, I will pass presenter over to you. So thank you very much, Chris. Appreciate all of the information that you shared. And we'll move this over to last but certainly not least, Jay Ward. Jay is MediSpend's Director of Life Sciences Solutions. He has 30 years of experience in military service leadership, compliance, and HCP management in medical device companies, which includes 7 years as a MediSpend transparency and HCP engagement client. So before joining MediSpend, Jay was the Ethics and Compliance Director at Lima USA. Earlier in his career, Jay held compliance, HCP management, and R&D positions at Bioventus, Stryker Orthopedics, and Datascope Patient Monitoring, Mindray. Prior to his medical device experience, Jay served as a U.S. Army officer for 12 years. So feel free to take it away, Jay.
Thank you, Katie. I appreciate it, and thank you for your for that kind introduction. While I'm waiting for my slides to pull up here, just wanted to say good morning, everybody. Hopefully, you're enjoying this this summit so far. And as we bring it home, I think this will tie nicely into what Mark and Chris have shared so far, because we've been talking about the risks from government perspective. We've been talking about risk assessment, and one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is how we go about managing and auditing and monitoring those risks. So I don't know about you, but I'm a very visual person. And as I think back to the experience that Katie alluded to in my roles in HCP and compliance programs, one of the things that we do in compliance is try to make sense out of a lot of the gray, and for me, I'm always a very visual person. And so in my compliance experience, I was always seeing this data. And, one of the questions I kept asking myself was, how can I bring this data to the light? How can I paint, a picture, whether it's for my chief compliance officer, my executive leadership, or my sales organization in the field, and be able to paint different pictures for them as to how we're performing in our compliance program. So the first thing I wanted to do was really kind of sit down and make some sense out of it. I knew I wanted to be able to analyze this data, but I needed to understand it first. And so when we talk about data analytics, we're really talking about two key components. So if we look at the definition, one key component is the collection, transformation, and organization of that data. But that in and of itself is not enough. Now we need to take that data and we need to analyze it and be able to draw insights and conclusions. We need to be able to make predictions, and we need to be able to drive informed decision making. And so when we look at the 4 types of data analytics, descriptive will tell us exactly what happened from that data. Diagnostic dives a little bit deeper and tells us why it happened. Predictive will help us understand what may likely happen in the future, and then prescriptive will tell us how to act. When we look at the process, like I said, you break this up into really 2 key components. So we, as we identify that question, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a future slide, then we need to be able to, identify our source system, collect all of our raw data, and clean and synthesize it in a way that we can then analyze it, interpret the results, and then take, the appropriate actions based on those results. Recent surveys showed that about 1 in 5 companies do not currently use data analytics in their ethics and compliance programs. However, I'll show on some of the next slides that that we should be incorporating data analytics into our compliance programs, and it's actually a government expectation that they have of us. But when we look at technology and how the compliance by design revolution have impacted our compliance programs, it's really put us in a position to be more intentional in how we design our compliance program. And because of that, we've seen this growth of data analytics tools. We've seen a growth in KPIs, dashboards, to basically help us monitor day-to-day business activities for some of the risks that Chris mentioned earlier, potentially identify potential issues before they arise. We always try to be proactive and get ahead of the issues before they arise instead of reacting to any potential misconduct that occurs. And when we think about Mark's presentation and some of the risks that of a government investigation or enforcement action or a corporate integrity agreement, the reality is if we do our data analytics programs correctly, this can potentially result in significant cost savings for the companies, and it can allow us to be more precise in targeting risk-based anti-corruption activities. And let's face it, I mean, I don't need to belabor this point. I'm sure every single one of you experiences this, that our global compliance landscape is challenging. It's evolving every day. It feels like every year new regulations come out, new countries are implementing transparency related or other anti-bribery, anti-corruption legislation. So we have to ask ourselves, in the wake of this challenging landscape that's constantly evolving, do we have the tools to do that? Do we have the tools to proactively identify and manage those risks? And like I said earlier, the government actually has an expectation that we're incorporating data analytics into our compliance programs. And the recent compliance program guidance that Mark referenced earlier, the OIG made several references to data and using data analytics to identify compliance risk areas. They highlighted, that compliance programs should actually have access to the data. So when we talk about compliance leadership and oversight as one of the elements of an effective compliance program, do we have the appropriate authority to be able to access the data we need to do our data analytics efforts? Now, as we evaluate our compliance programs, as we evaluate our business models, data analytics efforts can be simple to complex depending on how much data we're talking about, as well as, kind of where we are in the maturity of our compliance program and what our capabilities and resources are. And as I mentioned earlier, by analyzing that data, it allows us to get ahead of those possible risk areas. It'll identify outliers. I'll show a couple use cases where that could potentially help you in your compliance program. And then as we think about the resources that we have in our compliance program, do we have the right people on our team? I know oftentimes compliance programs, there's only a couple people, but within that team, we need to be looking at the type of skill sets that we have, and that includes having data experts, people who understand the abilities necessary to collect, analyze, and drive decision making through data. And really, when you look at the elements of an effective compliance program, your data analytics program can really inform every different element. For example, compliance policies and procedures. Maybe your data analytics program highlights a gap in your policies and procedures that you need to go back and revise. Maybe it's highlighted a need that I need to do more specialized compliance training. Maybe I need to revisit how I train my sales organization on our transparency responsibilities because of the data that I'm seeing and some of the analysis that we've done has highlighted potential noncompliance or potential risks in that area. And then ultimately, in some of the worst case scenarios, that data analytics may help us, respond to detected offenses, may help us identify potential corrective action initiatives. So within, it really helps, that we incorporate data analytics into our compliance program to help us, meet all the elements of an effective compliance program. Additionally, the Department of Justice has expectations that we incorporate data analytics into our compliance programs. And what they've done is basically they've encouraged their prosecutors to look at how compliance programs are using data analysis techniques to review business data, identify concerns, and they've taken this position of, well, we have access to data, and we have access to your data, so you should have access to your data. And as part of your auditing and monitoring efforts, the Department of Justice expects you to use that data analytically to test your policies, test your procedures, the program itself, look at specific transactions, and this needs to be a program. Your data analytics program needs to be something that is continuous. We should be doing data analysis in real time as opposed to just randomly. This isn't something that we do once a quarter, once every 6 months. We should be doing it in real time. And beyond that, we need to dive deeper into that data analytics and use more sophisticated analytics techniques besides just random sampling, because that will enable us to paint a more holistic picture with our data. Now, the Department of Justice does recognize that the challenge with data analytics is it's very difficult. As I mentioned earlier, when I talked about people's skill sets, it does require a specific skill set to be able to sift through volumes of data and to be able to drive informed decision making from that data analysis. So they do recognize that. They also recognize that when you think about all the systems that you have throughout your organization, that data is often sitting in silos, but in particular, as the DOJ set their expectations around data, some of the programs that they specifically called out are your processes for HCP engagements and your processes for grants and donations. So they recognize the inherent risk in those two programs, but they also recognize the volumes of data that comes from those programs and the need to analyze it. Most of us have heard the expression that if you don't know where you're going, you might wind up someplace else, or kind of a variation of that. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So when we think about where we start in our data analytics program, we need to identify where we're going, and so we need to approach our data analytics with a question in mind. What story are we trying to tell? And then as we ask that question, then we kind of take that next step, and that question will then help inform us what systems and sources do I need to go to be able to pull all this data from. One of the things that, in a recent transparency conference, one of the presenters recommended that we look at our risk prioritization in identifying where we start and the types of questions that we ask. For example, select a few risk areas, like your transparency data, like your grants program, or your interactions with healthcare professionals. It's often easy, we think about, the U.S. often, we got the federal anti-kickback statute. We know that's out there. We know that's a risk to our business, but we should also be looking at other geographies based on that risk prioritization as well. Now, as we begin this journey into data analytics, one of the things we have to do is to be able to assess the stakeholder readiness to embrace data. As we think about our audit committee, our compliance committee, our executive leadership team, how willing are they to step into the data analytics environment? I've been incredibly blessed in my past experiences in compliance roles where that was actually the expectations of our executive leadership to say, hey, I want a dashboard. I want something, to paint this picture for me so I can readily see how our compliance program is performing. And as we think about the questions that we're going to ask ourselves, they're a great resource. Help me help you. What are some things that in your role as an executive stakeholder or a member of our audit or compliance committee, what are some things that you want to know more about that we can then go back and do data analysis on? As I mentioned earlier, we're talking about multiple systems, multiple geographies. How do we assess the integrity of that data? We've all heard the expression garbage in, garbage out. So, how do we, first off, how do we pull all this data from all these systems? These systems aren't always talking to each other. There's not always the key integrations that need to occur to connect all of these different systems. So as we evaluate our data and analytics process, one of the questions that we should be asking as we, identify and, address what systems and sources we are going to use, we should be asking ourselves, do I need any system process improvements to improve my data integrity or the availability of my data? As you go through this process of analyzing your data, I think it's important to get some quick wins. Bring some information back to your stakeholders so that they could see quickly what data can do for them. As I talked earlier about, that stakeholder readiness, by bringing those quick wins back to the table, it will help them further embrace that and further, look forward to future data analytics efforts. But as I mentioned earlier, the Department of Justice and the government as a whole have this expectation that we're not just doing data analytics periodically. So instead of thinking about it as a destination, we need to think about it as a journey. And when you look at the entire life cycle of interacting with healthcare professionals, anything from your organizational needs assessment to your fair market value, the engagements, the payments, your transparency and your transfers of value that you're reporting, just think, as you look at this life cycle, think about just the volumes of data and the different types of data that reside in each one of those modules. And so how do we synthesize that? When we look at, the tools that ManySpend has, one of the things that I had the opportunity in a compliance role at my last company to evaluate was the Insights Pro tool. And the great thing about the Insights Pro was it had the ability for me to be able to take all those different modules and bring all that data and tie the entire life cycle of the HCP engagement together in one area that I can paint a picture for my compliance and business leaders, and not only that, but it allowed me as a compliance professional to ask that question that I talked about earlier, and then be able to build the dashboards that I needed to be able to answer that question. And it allowed me to take fragmented processes and systems, and because of the integrations that we had with the other systems that where that data truly resided, I was able to pull all that together and be able to paint those dashboards in a way that answered those questions and gave my executive leadership visual insights into how their HCP engagement program was performing. As we look at the current landscape, and some of the potential areas out there that we have that we can do data analysis on. One area that has become a very prevalent topic at recent transparency and HCP program conferences is the CMS audits. We know that, in December 2022 or early 2023, that CMS started doing random audits in addition to any for-cause audits. And when we looked at, kind of how these audits started, basically what we saw was a shift. CMS had been collecting data for 10 years. And by now engaging in, random auditing, it kind of showed a shift in CMS's efforts in the transparency program. So the question that is on a lot of life sciences companies' minds right now is, are we ready in the event that we receive that letter in the mail from CMS that we're going to be audited? So there's steps that we can take today. Let's just start with the publicly available data that we submitted to CMS. That's what CMS has access to. Are there any, one question we could potentially ask ourselves is, are there any outliers in my data, that's publicly available that may, raise a concern or a red flag of some kind to CMS and potentially put us at greater risk for some form of audit? How easily, when we consider all of the different systems that go into this transparency data, whether it's our ERP, whether it's our SaaS tool like Medi-Spin's transparency solution, whether it's Concur, or even the data that we're pulling in from third parties that are managing, certain HCP interactions for us. How easy is it for me to, consolidate that data? Is the data flow mapped out in a way that makes sense? And then are there any anomalies in that data? For example, as we think about, so we've got expenses coming into Concur. When it comes into our transparency solution, we're looking at that data and maybe we're making adjustments to it for certain reasons. Maybe there's discrepancies that have been identified. So, as we evaluate that entire data flow process, how do we identify those type of disparities between what came in from an ERP system or from Concur and what we ultimately reported? We know things happen, right? Oftentimes, in the process of submitting a meal, for example, there may be, some kind of adjustment because the head count was reported incorrectly or something along those lines, but those are the kind of questions that we're seeing that CMS auditors are asking because they're looking at your entire data flow. And then when they see that discrepancy between what was reported in Concur and what was ultimately reported to CMS, that begs the question for us to be able to explain that discrepancy. So, do we have the right policies and procedures? Do we have the right, systems in place to be able to walk through that entire data flow, be able to analyze that data in a way to answer those questions? When we look at the speaker programs, we looked at, the special fraud alert that came out, a few years ago, and that continues to be a prevalent topic for life sciences companies, and there's opportunities in there to evaluate some of the data as well. So let's say, for example, fair market value and the payment structure of those arrangements. we can look at the data for the attendees. What kind of specialties are attending these? How frequently are the same HCPs attending, these speaker programs? Are we, and do we have the right policies in place, to kind of cap maybe, for example, cap the frequency that an HCP can attend a particular program on the same topic unless there's new or additional information. With the attendees and speakers, we're reimbursing expenses. The data can tell us the story of whether or not those expense reimbursements are consistent with our policies and procedures. And then, to kind of take take an even broader step back away from those two specific use cases. When we look at HCP engagements, as I mentioned earlier, when you think about each module within the life cycle of managing interactions with healthcare professionals, there's just so many opportunities, and just sitting down, I just kind of, carved out, a couple here and there for each one of those modules. And this is by no means meant to be an exhaustive list, but it just serves the point that within each one of those modules there's so much data. So what questions are you trying to ask in your mind, as it relates to each one of those processes, and then begin your data analysis from that question. But the reality is, when we think about data analytics, once we analyze the data, we put together this great dashboard or KPIs or something to inform our executive leadership. That's all well and good. But data analytics ultimately has to inform our decisions and the actions that we take as a result of that data analysis. Compliance programs, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but we need to be using our data to be proactive instead of reacting to, any potential misconduct that may have been suspected. So by being proactive, we can potentially get ahead of any issues before they become significant. We can use that data to inform the key stakeholders, as I've referenced throughout this presentation. We can, revise policies and procedures. So let's say for speakers programs, as an example, we identified a gap in our policies and procedures. Hey, maybe we need to, for speakers programs, we need to actually, we need to document that, hey, HCPs can only attend a program one time unless there's, substantive information that's different from one program to the next. As we look at, we're actually going to be coming out with a blog here in the near future about, what we can do with our transparency data as it relates to training and educating our organizations, on that transparency data, on our responsibilities, obligations, and on the data itself that we're reporting. So maybe as part of our data analysis on our transparency data, and based off of the findings that we take out of that, maybe we need to go back and say, hey, we need to do, targeted training. Maybe we need to sit down with the sales organization and revisit the process that they're reporting their educational meals. Or maybe we need to take, either that data or other data analytics efforts that we've done and maybe put together a newsletter or a case study, or something to kind of further help train and educate the organization on what's actually going on, in the organization. The way I always looked at it was, let's use transparency for a second. When we think about, our transparency data, what we're doing in our compliance programs is we are basically compiling, cleaning, and preparing for submission the data that sales, marketing, medical affairs, R&D, clinical, it's the data that they're generating, so how do we, take this data analytics efforts and train and educate them on their data and the issues that we saw as we went through the process of preparing it for submission, or even, in our routine auditing and monitoring efforts. And then ultimately, in the worst case, it's never the role that we enjoy as part of our compliance programs, but we do it to protect the organization. Maybe there is something in our data analytics efforts that puts us in a position to investigate further and look at any potential suspected misconduct. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't something that we do periodically. So, we need to continue our data collection and analysis, and we can do that for multiple reasons. One is, so let's say, as I mentioned earlier, we're, revising policies and procedures, or we're, revamping our training and education program. Well, how do we measure that? How do we measure the impact of the actions that we did take? And so maybe a year from now, we go back and we ask ourselves the same question that we asked today, and then be able to measure the impact of those actions over time. As we continue to build a more robust data collection and analysis program, we're going to have more opportunities for more robust trending. The more data we have, the more it can potentially inform us. And then, from small snapshots in time, we can then be able to eventually do maybe a year-over-year analysis to demonstrate how our program is improving or not over those periods. So as we wrap this up, I think so we've established that the government has an expectation, especially with the technological advances that we have, the systems that we have, just tremendous amounts of data out there. The government recognizes that. So their expectations are that we're leveraging the power of that data as well. So data analytics is really crucial to your auditing and monitoring programs. As Chris talked about, the risk assessment, we recognize that interacting with healthcare professionals is a key compliance risk because of Anti-Kickback, False Claims Act, Sunshine Act, and other anti-bribery and anti-corruption issues. So we need to be asking ourselves, every day, how can I proactively paint this picture of how well the HCP program is functioning? How can I potentially identify key watchouts and then address potential areas for further review? And then lastly, I think the MediSpends engagement solutions, allow us to facilitate that data analytics program, whether it's through being able to consolidate all these different modules into one cohesive system, or having a tool like Insights Pro that can help us predict, preempt, monitor, and manage risk, and also be able to paint that picture for your key stakeholders in a way that they can easily understand. So with that, I appreciate your time and attention, and I'll turn it back over to Katie if there's any questions.
Thanks, Jay. So we did have a question, and I believe it's related to the CMS audit. So it says, do we know who is being audited and why they were selected?
So from the recent transparency conferences, this topic was asked a couple times and in some of the different sessions. And so far, I don't know that we've necessarily identified any specific reason why specific companies are targeted. One session in particular did encourage us to, again, to look at that transparency data and identify any potential anomalies in that data. There one session in particular, and I think we published a blog on this, Katie. One session in particular kind of went through it was a fictitious case study, and as they walked through that case study, that was one of the things that they highlighted was they created this scenario that I think did have some factual elements to it, where there were significant anomalies in like the research data that had been reported, which kind of precipitated, the need for further audit. But we haven't necessarily synthesized any specific reason why specific companies are being targeted.
Excellent. Thanks, Jay. So that was the only question that we had come in. So we are going to close out our summit right now. Like I said, the presentations that you saw today are all in the handout section. Please take a look. We will be sending out the recording of this summit to everyone who attended. So keep your eye on your inboxes for that as well. Again, we thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to doing more of these in the future. And we hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. Thank you.